pardon. Joining us now is Democratic Congressman Krishnamoorthi. He serves on both the House Intelligence and Oversight Committees. So, Congressman, you've heard from Michael Cohen both in public and in private. So when he says, "I never asked for a pardon," was he lying?
First of all, thanks for having me on, John. I wanted to just say that I can't get into the closed-door testimony of Michael Cohen. I think that in open setting and also, as explained by his lawyer, there is a narrative that he's presenting with regard to the pardons. The one thing that the biggest question that this testimony raises is that I think the president has potentially abused the pardon power, and that's why I and others have introduced the Presidential Pardon Transparency Act, which recognizes that the president does have the prerogative to pardon, but there has to be sunlight and transparency as to how he uses that power.
It does absolutely raise questions about were pardons dangled and to what extent. But now, talking about his public testimony, we were there, we watched it, we just played it there, and talking about CNN's reporting along with the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post, that Michael Cohen's current attorney, Lanny Davis, said that the former attorney, Stephen Ryan, was directed to ask about a pardon. When Michael Cohen said in public, "I never asked for a pardon," do you have concerns he was lying?
Well, I think that what Mr. Davis has said in the open is that there's a certain time frame that Mr. Cohen's previous testimony applied to. And so I think that you'd have to kind of dive into exactly what that time frame is with Mr. Davis, but they've presented a narrative which they believe to be consistent. But again, I think it goes to the bigger question:
do you believe
is the presidential power being abused?
Do you believe it to be consistent, though, Congressman?
I think that overall, based on what I've seen, I think that it appears to be consistent based on the narrative that he's been presenting. But that being said, I think that the bigger question remains: is the pardon power being abused by the president?
Do you or have you seen evidence, direct evidence, that raises questions in your mind that the Trump team was open for business when it comes to pardons?
Well, I think that if you look at the president's tweets talking about how Paul Manafort is a hero for not cooperating, and then Michael Cohen is a rat for cooperating with the special counsel, that again implicates potentially the pardon power and potentially rewarding those who cooperate with the president and those who've turned state's evidence, so to speak.
Any evidence you've seen on these two committees, though? And yes, I've seen the tweets. It is notable Paul Manafort's getting sentenced today. So if the president's going to pardon Paul Manafort, he's got to hurry up and do it before he actually, serves more time. But have you seen evidence in your committees that the issues of pardons were dangled?
Again, I can't get into what happened in closed-door settings. But however, what we've seen in the open settings, as well as just the testimony that's publicly known, we know that the president has been talking about pardons and that his team has also been indirectly dangling this potential pardons to those who are cooperating.
So we understand CNN was the first to report yesterday that Michael Cohen produced his written testimony from 2017, where he now admitted he pleaded guilty to lying about the timeline of the Trump Tower project in Moscow. And he's given that to the House Intelligence Committee and shown the edits that he says were made by the president's lawyers. Can you tell us if there were substantive changes to that testimony?
What I can say is that he did produce a lot of documents as part of his testimony yesterday. It seemed to corroborate his verbal testimony, making him more credible. And as you know, his verbal testimony in the open setting before the Oversight Committee was very clear that the president's attorneys assisted him in changing his statement. And as you know, that statement was materially false enough that he'd be convicted of lying to Congress.
Lanny Davis, again, who's Michael Cohen's current attorney,
yes, sir,
told us overnight that it was Michael Cohen who was the author and the sole author of the timeline, suggesting that his discussions with the president about Trump Tower stopped much earlier than they did. Do you have any reason to believe that when the president's legal team reviewed that they knew it was false?
Well, let me put it this way. Again, based on the open testimony and what we know about what the president knew and did in 2016, the president clearly was continuing to negotiate with the Russians through Michael Cohen with regard to the Trump Tower in Moscow. And so to the extent that he knew, his attorneys knew, and so when they saw January 2016 as being the end date in the timeline that even Michael Cohen presented, that obviously is their knowledge of a materially false fact.
Well, is it as obvious as that, though? Because do we know that the president told his lawyers, no, this discussion went on much longer? Do we know that Michael Cohen, for sure, do we know that the president knew for sure that Michael Cohen was going to go in and lie?
What we know is that his attorneys actually reviewed this particular document.
Right.
And those attorneys obviously are representing the president, and they presumably knew what the timeline was that Michael Cohen was presenting, as well as what the president actually did during 2016. And those two things contradict each other.
And I appreciate you letting me press you on this, because these details in these sort of hinge points here really do matter, because they get to Michael Cohen's credibility and they get to the potential culpability of the president and his legal team. So let me ask you in a general sense, though, as you are a member of both of these key committees, what do you think the next most important single thing is to focus on?
With regard to this particular timeline, or just generally?
Generally.
Well, I think the next thing generally is that there are various witnesses that were actually called out by Michael Cohen within his open testimony in the Oversight Committee, as well as in the Intel Committee. And I think that the next logical steps would be to call those witnesses in and ask them to testify as to the particular events in question. As Chairman Cummings said in the Oversight Committee, Michael Cohen laid out various names of witnesses, and we should follow the transcript as to who should be called in next.
Congressman Roger Krishnamoorthi, thank you very